I was lying in the hospital room when the door opened and a doctor in his 30s walked in. "Mrs. Wilson, the tests are complete. I'm afraid we're seeing early signs of Alzheimer's," he said. In that moment, I looked at his face and realized he hadn't actually done any tests. I knew I would make him pay for this misdiagnosis, and it would turn me into America's most famous grandmother. My name is Eleanor Wilson, and at 76 years old, I never expected to find myself in a hospital bed at Mercy General being told I was losing my mind. It all started 3 weeks earlier when my daughter Sarah insisted I see a doctor after I forgot to call her on her birthday. "Mom, this is the 3rd time you've forgotten something important this month," she said, her voice tight with worry. "First the stove, then your medication, now my birthday. We need to make sure everything's okay." I wanted to tell her that I'd been distracted because I was organizing a surprise party for my grandson's graduation, that the stove incident happened because the phone rang right as I was making tea, and that I hadn't forgotten her birthday at all. I was giving her space because her husband had just left her, and I thought she might want a quiet day. But the look in her eyes stopped me. She was genuinely frightened. So I agreed to the appointment, mainly to ease her mind. What harm could it do? Dr. James Reynolds was assigned to my case, young, handsome, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that probably charmed most of his patients. But there was something in the way he looked at me, or rather, the room me, that set off alarm bells. I've spent 40 years working as a bank manager. I know when someone isn't seeing the person in front of them. "So, Mrs. Wilson, your daughter tells me you've been experiencing some memory issues," he said, barely glancing up from his tablet. "I've been a bit distracted lately, but I wouldn't call them memory issues," I replied. He nodded absently. "At your age, it's quite common to see cognitive decline. Let's run some tests to rule out anything serious." At my age? 3 little words that told me everything I needed to know about Dr. Reynolds. In his mind, I was already categorized: elderly, declining, probably confused. The tests consisted of asking me to remember 3 objects: apple, table, and penny, count backward from 100 by sevens, and tell him who the president was. I answered everything correctly, even throwing in the vice president and secretary of state for good measure. "Very good," he said with the same tone people use when a child ties their shoes. "We'll also need some blood work and a brain scan." The nurse who drew my blood was kind, chatting with me about her grandmother who had recently turned 90 and still played bridge weekly. The technician who did my brain scan was professional and explained everything he was doing. They treated me like a person. Dr. Reynolds treated me like a diagnosis waiting to happen. A week later, I was called back to discuss my results, and that's when I found myself in that hospital room being told I had early-stage Alzheimer's. "The test shows some concerning patterns," he said, again not quite meeting my eyes. "We're seeing atrophy in areas typically associated with early-stage Alzheimer's." "May I see the scans?" I asked. He looked surprised but turned his tablet toward me for a brief moment. I caught a glimpse of brain images, but they weren't labeled with my name. The birth date at the corner was blurry, but I could make out enough to know that it wasn't mine. "Those aren't my scans," I said quietly. Dr. Reynolds pulled the tablet back quickly. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand this is upsetting news, but denial is a common first response. The scans are definitely yours." I felt a cold anger rise within me, but also something else, a strange sort of clarity. In that moment, I realized what was happening. This man hadn't bothered to look at my results properly. He'd made assumptions based on my age and my daughter's concerns, and now he was giving me a life-altering diagnosis without due diligence. But instead of exploding with rage, I did something that surprised even me. I started to cry. "Oh my goodness," I sobbed, pulling a tissue from the box beside the bed. Alzheimer's, but I don't want to forget my family, my grandchildren. Dr. Reynolds' posture relaxed visibly. This was the reaction he expected. The confused elderly woman, devastated by her diagnosis, not questioning his authority. "We'll start you on medication right away," he said, his voice taking on that practiced, sympathetic tone. "And your daughter mentioned you live alone. That might need to change as the condition progresses." I nodded meekly, dabbing at my eyes. "What's going to happen to me, doctor?" He launched into his rehearsed speech about treatment options, care facilities, and how families cope with Alzheimer's patients, all while I was making mental notes and forming a plan. You see, before I managed that bank manager, I spent 5 years working for a law firm that specialized in medical malpractice. I knew exactly what constituted negligence, and Dr. Reynolds had just checked every box. But more than that, I recognized a systemic problem: how easily elderly patients could be dismissed, misdiagnosed, and effectively erased by healthcare providers who didn't take the time to see them as individuals. As I left the hospital that day, clutching a prescription I had no intention of filling and a pamphlet about living with Alzheimer's, I made a decision. Dr. Reynolds wouldn't just pay for what he'd done to me. He would become an example, and I would use this misdiagnosis to shed light on a problem faced by too many elderly patients. Little did I know that my plan would not only expose medical negligence, but would ultimately transform me from a supposedly confused old woman into the patient advocate known throughout the hospital as the Queen, and eventually to millions across America as Grandma Justice. But first, I had to convince my daughter that I was losing my mind, even as I plotted the most mentally demanding campaign of my life. What would that brilliant young doctor say if he knew the confused old lady was about to use his carelessness to change the entire hospital system and make him the unwitting star of a nationwide scandal?
"Mom, I think we should look at assisted living facilities," Sarah said, setting a cup of tea in front of me. It had been 2 weeks since my misdiagnosis, and I'd played my role perfectly, forgetting small things intentionally, appearing confused about dates, and asking the same questions multiple times. I took a sip of tea and gazed at my daughter with what I hoped was a convincing mixture of confusion and fear. "But this is my home, Sarah. I've lived here since you were a little girl." Sarah's eyes welled with tears. "I know, Mom, but Dr. Reynolds says your condition will progress, and it's better to get you settled somewhere with professional care before it gets worse." I reached across the table and took her hand. The guilt I felt for deceiving her was real, but I reminded myself of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about me anymore. "What about those medications the doctor prescribed? Aren't they supposed to help?" I asked. "They might slow the progression, but they're not a cure," Sarah replied, repeating almost verbatim what Dr. Reynolds had told her. "Dr. Reynolds suggested we should prepare for the future now while you can still participate in the decision. While I can still participate." The implication being that soon I wouldn't be capable of making decisions about my own life. The injustice of it burned inside me, fueling my resolve. "I understand," I said softly, "but before we do anything drastic, I'd like a second opinion." Sarah hesitated. "Dr. Reynolds is the head of geriatric medicine at Mercy, Mom. He's the expert." "Still," I insisted, letting a hint of my real determination show through. "It's my mind we're talking about, my life." After some discussion, Sarah agreed to set up an appointment with another neurologist, Dr. Lisa Chen, at University Hospital. What she didn't know was that I had already done my research. Dr. Chen was known for her thorough approach and had published several papers challenging the rush to diagnose Alzheimer's in elderly patients without comprehensive testing. I also had another appointment scheduled that Sarah knew nothing about, with Timothy Blackwell, a former colleague from my banking days who had gone on to become one of the top medical malpractice attorneys in the state. The day after my conversation with Sarah, I visited Tim's office, bringing with me a journal where I documented everything: dates, times, exactly what Dr. Reynolds had said, and notes about the incorrect brain scan he had shown me. "Eleanor, this is serious," Tim said, after reviewing my notes. "If what you're saying is accurate, this is a clear case of negligence." Tim? "This is serious," Tim said, after reviewing my notes. "If what you're saying is accurate, this is a clear case of negligence." I told him the story, but not the rest of my plan. "What do you exactly want to do here, Eleanor? File a lawsuit? Seek compensation?" I shook my head. "I want something bigger, Tim. I want accountability. I want change. Too many elderly patients are being rushed through the system, prescribed medications they don't need, or pushed into facilities they don't require. I want to expose this." Tim leaned back in his chair, studying me. "That's ambitious, Eleanor, and it could get messy." "I've never been afraid of mess," I replied, thinking of the decades I'd spent cleaning up other people's financial disasters at the bank, and I'm certainly not going to start now, when it matters most. We formulated a plan. Tim would help me gather evidence and build a case, not just against Dr. Reynolds, but against the systemic issues at Mercy General. Meanwhile, I would continue to play the role of a woman with early-stage Alzheimer's, both to maintain my cover and to document how I was treated by various healthcare providers. My appointment with Dr. Chen was eye-opening. She spent nearly an hour with me, asking detailed questions about my medical history, my daily activities, and the specific instances of forgetfulness that had concerned Sarah. She smiled as she showed me my scans. "Your brain structure looks normal for a woman of your age, Mrs. Wilson. No significant atrophy or abnormalities. Your blood work shows a slight vitamin B12 deficiency, which can affect memory and cognition, but nothing that suggests Alzheimer's disease." I feigned surprise and relief, but inside, I was filled with righteous vindication. I had been right. "What about the diagnosis from Mercy General?" I asked. Dr. Chen frowned. "I can't comment specifically on another doctor's diagnosis without reviewing their findings, but I would be happy to consult with Dr. Reynolds if you'd like." "I would love that," I said, knowing exactly what would happen when she requested my records from Mercy General. As I left University Hospital that day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The second phase of my plan was now in motion. Dr. Chen would request my records, discover the inadequate testing, and likely raise concerns. Meanwhile, Tim was already working to identify other elderly patients who may have received similar hasty diagnoses from Dr. Reynolds. But I still needed more evidence, something irrefutable that would prove Dr. Reynolds' negligence wasn't a one-time mistake, but a pattern. And for that, I needed allies inside Mercy General itself. I remembered the kind nurse who had drawn my blood, the one who spoke so lovingly about her grandmother. Her name tag read Maria Rodriguez. Could she be my way in? That evening, I made a few calls to old friends who were still connected to the hospital world. By the next morning, I had Maria's full name and learned she worked in the geriatric ward 3 days a week. I also discovered something interesting. Maria was taking night classes in gerontology, specializing in elder care advocacy. She might be exactly the ally I needed. I scheduled a follow-up appointment with Dr. Reynolds, ostensibly to discuss my medication, but really to make contact with Maria again. As I sat in the examination room, waiting, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would approach her without raising suspicion. The door opened, and there she was, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm Nurse Rodriguez. I'll be taking your vitals before Dr. Reynolds comes in." I smiled warmly at her. "Of course I remember you, dear. You told me about your grandmother who plays bridge." Maria looked pleased. That's right. Wow, good memory for someone with... She trailed off, looking embarrassed. For someone with Alzheimer's, I finished for her. Then, lowering my voice, I added, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, in private. Maria glanced at the door, then back at me, curiosity and concern mingling in her expression. Mrs. Wilson, is everything okay? Not really, and I think you might be one of the few people who can help me do something about it. What would this compassionate young nurse say when I revealed my secret? Would she become the first ally in my quest to expose the truth, or would she alert Dr. Reynolds and destroy my plan before it had really begun?
Maria looked at me for a long moment, then closed the door quietly. "What's going on, Mrs. Wilson?" she asked, her voice low. I took a deep breath. This was a gamble, but my instincts about people had served me well through 40 years in banking. Maria had kind eyes and a determined set to her jaw, the look of someone with principles. "I don't have Alzheimer's," I said simply. "Dr. Reynolds misdiagnosed me without proper testing. I've gotten a second opinion that confirms I'm fine, aside from a slight vitamin deficiency." Maria's eyes widened. Are you sure?" I nodded and briefly explained my visit to Dr. Chen, the thorough testing and the clear results. "But why are you back here then?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Because I believe Dr. Reynolds has done this to other patients, and I want to stop it." I met her gaze steadily. "I've learned you're studying gerontology with a focus on elder advocacy. I'm hoping that means you care about this issue too." Maria's posture changed, her shoulders squaring. "You have no idea," she whispered. "My grandmother, the one who plays bridge, was diagnosed with dementia by a doctor at her previous facility. My family almost put her in a memory care unit, but my aunt insisted on a second opinion. Turns out she was just having side effects from a new blood pressure medication." I felt a surge of validation. Exactly. And how many elderly patients don't get that second opinion? How many are medicated unnecessarily or placed in facilities they don't need because a doctor took shortcuts? Maria glanced nervously at the door. "Mrs. Wilson, I completely agree with you, but what exactly are you planning to do, and why are you telling me?" "I need someone on the inside, someone who has access to records and can help me identify patterns. I'm working with a medical malpractice attorney, but we need evidence that this isn't just happening to me." Maria bit her lip. That's asking a lot. I could lose my job. I could lose my nursing license." "I know, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't think this was important. Think of all the elderly patients who are being robbed of their autonomy, their dignity, because of lazy diagnoses." Before Maria could respond, we heard footsteps approaching. She quickly moved to take my blood pressure as the door opened and Dr. Reynolds walked in. "Mrs. Wilson, good to see you," he said with that same dismissive cheerfulness. "How are you finding the medication?" "It's confusing," I said, slipping back into my role as a confused elderly patient. "Sometimes I take it and sometimes I forget." I looked helplessly at Maria, who was watching our interaction with new awareness. Dr. Reynolds barely suppressed a sigh. "Nurse Rodriguez, please note that Mrs. Wilson needs medication management assistance. We should speak with her daughter about a pill organizer or possibly home health visits." "Yes, doctor," Maria replied, her voice neutral, but her eyes telling a different story. The appointment continued, with Dr. Reynolds speaking primarily to his tablet rather than to me. When he left, Maria lingered, pretending to organize supplies.
I'll help you, but we need to be careful, very careful. Over the next few weeks, Maria became my eyes and ears at Mercy General. She couldn't access patient records directly, that would be illegal, but she could observe patterns and gather information about procedures that were being skipped or rushed, particularly with elderly patients. Meanwhile, I continued my charade at home. Sarah had started researching assisted living facilities, and it broke my heart to see her worry. Several times I almost confessed everything to her, but I knew she might inadvertently alert Dr. Reynolds, and we weren't ready yet. Tim's investigation was progressing too. Through carefully worded ads and outreach to senior centers, we had identified 5 other patients who believed they had been misdiagnosed by doctors at Mercy General, 3 of them specifically by Dr. Reynolds. "We're building a solid case, Eleanor," Tim assured me, "but we need more. Something concrete that shows this is systematic and not just a few isolated incidents." That something concrete arrived unexpectedly one evening when Maria called me, her voice tense with excitement. "Mrs. Wilson, I overheard something today. The hospital is conducting an internal audit of the geriatric department. Apparently, their prescription rates for memory medications are significantly higher than the national average, and insurance companies are asking questions." "That's exactly what we need," I said, feeling a surge of hope. "Can you find out more about this audit?" "I'll try," Maria promised. "But there's something else. I noticed Dr. Reynolds has a pattern. He tends to push for these quick diagnoses at the end of the quarter. I think it might be related to performance bonuses." The pieces were falling into place. If Dr. Reynolds was diagnosing patients with conditions that required expensive medications or specialized care to meet quotas or earn bonuses, that wasn't just negligence, it was fraud. With this new information, Tim suggested we approach the hospital board directly. If they're already conducting an audit, they know something's wrong. Your testimony, along with the others we've gathered, might be exactly what they need to take action. I agreed, and Tim arranged a confidential meeting with 2 board members. The day before the meeting, I finally told Sarah the truth. Her reaction progressed from disbelief to anger to relief. "You mean you don't have—" She couldn't even finish the sentence before bursting into tears and hugging me tightly. "I'm so sorry I put you through this," I said, holding her close. "But we have a chance to make sure this doesn't happen to other families." Sarah wiped her eyes, a new determination on her face. "What can I do to help?" With Sarah now part of our growing alliance, we prepared for the board meeting. Tim had compiled a comprehensive report detailing not just my experience, but the patterns we'd uncovered with Maria's help. The other misdiagnosed patients had provided sworn statements. We had evidence of rushed diagnoses, inappropriate prescriptions, and the suspicious timing coinciding with quarterly reviews. As I dressed for the meeting, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Nervousness, certainly, but also a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Since retiring from the bank, I'd filled my days with gardening and grandchildren, both joys I treasured. But this, standing up against injustice, using my experience and skills to protect others, this felt like what I was meant to do in this chapter of my life. Sarah drove me to the hospital, squeezing my hand before I went in. "Show them what happens when they underestimate Eleanor Wilson," she said with a proud smile. I walked into the boardroom with my head high, Tim beside me, and a folder of evidence in my hands. The board members looked surprised. Perhaps they had expected a frail, confused woman instead of the determined advocate who stood before them. "Good morning," I said confidently. "My name is Eleanor Wilson, and I'm here to tell you how your head of geriatric medicine almost robbed me of the final chapter of my life, and how many of your elderly patients may not have been as fortunate as I was to discover the truth."
Would the board members listen to an elderly woman challenging one of their top doctors? Or would they close ranks and protect their own, forcing us to take more drastic measures to expose the truth? The boardroom was silent as I finished presenting our evidence. The two board members, Dr. Amelia Patel, Chief of Internal Medicine, and Richard Winters, the hospital's legal counsel, exchanged glances. Mrs. Wilson, Dr. Patel finally said, "These are extremely serious allegations." "They are," I agreed, "and they're substantiated by evidence, testimonies, and your own internal audit numbers." Mr. Winters tapped his pen against the polished table. "While we appreciate you bringing this to our attention, we need to conduct our own investigation before any action can be taken." "Of course," Tim interjected smoothly. "However, we want to be clear that we're prepared to take this information to state medical authorities and the press if necessary." It wasn't an idle threat. Sarah, who worked in public relations, had already helped us draft press releases and identified journalists who specialized in healthcare stories. Dr. Patel leaned forward. "That won't be necessary. We take patient care very seriously at Mercy General. If what you're saying is true, we want to address it immediately." She paused. "However, I must ask, why didn't you simply report this when you received the second opinion from Dr. Chen?" It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. Because this isn't about one doctor making one mistake with one patient. This is about a system that allows elderly patients to be rushed through, misdiagnosed, and potentially placed in inappropriate care settings. Dr. Reynolds is a symptom of a larger problem, one that I've seen affecting friends my age across multiple healthcare settings. Mr. Winters looked skeptical, but Dr. Patel nodded slowly. "You mentioned Nurse Rodriguez has been helping you gather information. I assume without accessing confidential records." "Absolutely," I confirmed. "Maria has been extremely careful to respect patient confidentiality. She simply observed patterns and procedures as part of her normal duties." The meeting ended with a promise from the board to conduct a thorough investigation and report back within 2 weeks. As Tim and I left the hospital, I felt cautiously optimistic. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" I asked Tim. "Hard to say. They're definitely concerned about potential liability. The question is whether they'll address the root issues or just try to minimize the damage." The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, I received a call from Dr. Patel herself, asking if I could meet with her privately. Sensing the importance of this conversation, I agreed, but insisted that Tim accompany me. We met at a small cafe away from the hospital. Dr. Patel looked tired but resolute as she joined us. "Our preliminary investigation confirms many of your concerns," she said without preamble. "Dr. Reynolds' diagnosis rate for cognitive disorders is significantly higher than his peers, and we've identified at least 7 cases similar to yours in the past year alone." "And?" Tim prompted. "And the board is divided on how to proceed," Dr. Patel admitted. "Some want to handle this internally, reassign Dr. Reynolds, update our protocols, and quietly make amends to affected patients." "That's not enough," I said firmly. "That doesn't address the systemic issues or prevent this from happening again at Mercy or elsewhere." Dr. Patel nodded. "I agree, which is why I'm here. I believe we need to be more transparent, but I'm facing resistance. I need your help to convince the board to take more substantial action." This unexpected alliance shifted the dynamics of our campaign. With Dr. Patel's insider knowledge and my growing network of affected patients and concerned healthcare workers, we developed a comprehensive proposal for the board: a complete overhaul of geriatric care protocols, mandatory second opinions for cognitive disorder diagnoses, and a patient advocacy program specifically for elderly patients. The most controversial element was our insistence on public transparency, acknowledging past mistakes and detailing the steps being taken to address them. A week later, we presented our proposal to the full board.
The room was tense, with clear divisions among the members. Some saw the wisdom in getting ahead of the story and positioning Mercy as a leader in reform. Others feared the financial and reputational damage of admitting to systematic problems. The debate continued for hours until I finally stood up, commanding the attention of the room. "I'm 76 years old," I began. "In Dr. Reynolds' eyes, and perhaps in some of yours, that makes me less valuable, less worth the time and resources required for proper care. But I spent 40 years managing millions of dollars at First National Bank. I raised a daughter who runs a successful PR firm. I volunteer teaching financial literacy at the community center. My age doesn't diminish my worth, it enhances my perspective." I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. This isn't just about Mercy General. This is about how we treat our elderly population across the entire healthcare system. You have an opportunity to lead meaningful change. Don't waste it because you're afraid of temporary discomfort. In the end, the board voted 8-5 to implement our proposals, including the public transparency component. Dr. Reynolds was placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his cases. The hospital's public statement acknowledging the issues and outlining their reform plans made headlines across the state. Sarah's PR expertise helped shape the narrative, positioning Mercy as taking brave, proactive steps to address problems that likely existed in many hospitals. But what none of us expected was how quickly the story would spread or how deeply it would resonate. My phone began ringing with calls from elderly patients across the country sharing similar experiences. Journalists requested interviews. Medical advocacy groups reached out to collaborate. And Maria, who had been publicly recognized by the hospital for her ethical stand, after I insisted her role be acknowledged, suggested we start a formal organization to continue the work we had begun. "We could call it Grandma's Advocacy Network," she suggested with a smile, or GAN for short. "I was thinking dignity at any age," I countered, "but we can workshop it." Within a month, what had started as my personal fight for justice had evolved into a movement. We established a hotline for elderly patients who felt they had been misdiagnosed or mistreated. Medical students at the university volunteered to help review cases. Retired healthcare professionals offered their expertise. And somehow, amidst it all, I became known as the Queen. First among the nurses at Mercy, who had witnessed my transformation from a supposedly confused old patient to a powerful advocate, and then more broadly as the story spread. The nickname stuck when a national morning show interviewed me about our work. The host, charmed by my straightforward manner, commented, "You're like the queen of patient advocacy." The audience applauded, and just like that, Grandma Queen was born. As our initiative gained momentum, we faced new challenges. Some healthcare providers pushed back against what they saw as interference. Insurance companies worried about the cost implications of more thorough testing. And I received occasional criticism for being too harsh or vindictive. Criticism that rarely seemed to target male advocates with the same passion. But for every obstacle, we found unexpected allies and opportunities. And through it all, I kept returning to the question that had started this journey. What would have happened if I hadn't recognized that misdiagnosis? How many elderly patients were losing their autonomy, their dignity, their final years of independence because someone didn't take the time to see them as individuals? 6 months after my meeting with the board, I stood in the newly established Patient Advocacy Center at Mercy General, cutting the ribbon alongside Dr. Patel. The center would provide support specifically for elderly patients, ensuring they understood their diagnoses, treatment options, and their rights. As cameras flashed, I couldn't help but wonder what Dr. Reynolds would think if he could see me now. The confused old lady he so carelessly dismissed, now transforming the very institution where he had practiced. But the true test of our success was yet to come. Would our reforms create lasting change, or would old habits eventually reassert themselves once the spotlight faded?
1 year after my misdiagnosis, I sat in my garden, reflecting on how much had changed. Dignity at Any Age, the name we'd ultimately chosen for our organization, now had chapters in 15 states. We'd helped over 300 elderly patients get second opinions, resulting in nearly 40% having their initial diagnoses modified or overturned completely. Mercy General had become a model for geriatric care reform, with hospitals across the country studying and adopting our protocols. The Patient Advocacy Center was thriving under Maria's leadership. She'd completed her gerontology degree and been appointed as the center's director. As for Dr. Reynolds, the review of his cases had revealed a pattern of hasty diagnoses and over-medication that couldn't be ignored. The hospital had terminated his employment, and the state medical board was reviewing his license. I took no pleasure in his downfall. This had never been about revenge, but about accountability and change. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Sarah. "Mom, have you seen the news? The Senate Committee on Aging wants you to testify next month about elder care reform." I hadn't seen the news, but I wasn't entirely surprised. Our work had been gaining national attention, particularly after a prominent senator's mother had experienced a situation similar to mine. "They want the Queen herself," Sarah continued, excitement in her voice. "This could lead to federal legislation, Mom." The nickname still made me chuckle. From confused patient to Grandma Queen testifying before Congress, life certainly had unexpected turns. But even as DAA grew and our influence expanded, I remained focused on the individual stories. The 82-year-old former teacher who'd been incorrectly diagnosed with dementia when she was actually experiencing side effects from a new medication. The 78-year-old retired mechanic whose Parkinson's diagnosis was reversed after proper testing. The 90-year-old grandmother whose family was about to move her into memory care until our intervention revealed her cognitive issues were caused by an undiagnosed urinary tract infection. Each case reinforced what I had known from the beginning, that too often healthcare providers saw age before they saw the person. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Maria, arriving for our weekly strategy meeting, along with Tim and 2 new members of our team, Dr. Chen, who had left University Hospital to become DAA's medical director, and Robert Lee, a retired healthcare administrator who helped us navigate the complex systems we were working to change. "Big news day," Maria said as I welcomed them in. The Senate hearing request and the new CDC guidelines, both mentioning our work. We gathered around my dining room table, which had become our unofficial headquarters before we'd secured proper office space. The table where I had once sat with Sarah discussing assisted living facilities was now command central for a national advocacy movement. "The hearing is important," Tim acknowledged, "but I'm more concerned about sustainability. We've made impressive progress, but systems have a way of reverting to the path of least resistance once the spotlight fades." He's right, of course. Real, lasting change requires more than publicity and temporary measures. It requires structural reforms, ongoing vigilance, and a shift in how society viewed and valued its elderly members. "That's why the training programs are so crucial," Dr. Chen added. "We need to reach medical students before they develop these biases, help them understand that geriatric care requires more nuance, not less." We discussed strategies for the next phase of our work, expanding our training programs, developing simple diagnostic checklists that could help prevent hasty cognitive disorder diagnoses, and creating patient-friendly guides to help elderly people advocate for themselves in medical settings. As the meeting concluded and I walked everyone to the door, Maria hung back. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you. We're putting together a promotional video for the website featuring stories of patients who've been helped by DAA. Would you be willing to tell your story, the full story from the beginning?" I hesitated. While my role as the founder of DAA was public knowledge, I'd been relatively private about the details of my own experience, preferring to focus on the work rather than my personal narrative. "I understand if you'd rather not," Maria added, "but your story is what started all of this. It might help others recognize when they're being dismissed or misdiagnosed." That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat in my living room considering Maria's request. On my coffee table was a stack of letters from elderly patients and their families, people who had reached out to thank us for our help or to share their own stories. I picked up one from a woman named Dorothy in Maine. She had written, "I was ready to give up my apartment, my independence, everything. My doctor had me convinced I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. Your checklist of questions to ask made me push for more thorough testing, which showed I was experiencing side effects from my blood pressure medication, not dementia. You gave me my life back." Letters like Dorothy's were why I had started this work, not for recognition or to punish Dr. Reynolds, but because no elderly person should have their autonomy stripped away due to careless medicine. The next morning, I called Maria. I said, "I'll do it. I'll tell my story." 2 weeks later, I sat in a simply furnished room at the DAA office, facing the camera. The young videographer adjusted the lighting one last time and gave me a thumbs up. "Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Wilson." I took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. "My name is Eleanor Wilson. I'm 77 years old. 1 year ago, a doctor looked at me and saw only my age. He diagnosed me with a condition I didn't have, nearly robbing me of my independence, my dignity, and the final chapter of my life. This is my story, but it's also the story of countless elderly Americans who are misdiagnosed, overmedicated, and dismissed every day in our healthcare system." The words flowed easily as I recounted my experience. The initial appointment, the cursory examination, the moment I realized Dr. Reynolds had shown me someone else's brain scan. I described the fear and anger I'd felt and how those emotions had transformed into determination. "I could have simply reported Dr. Reynolds and moved on with my life," I explained to the camera. "But I knew that wouldn't solve the underlying problem. As long as our medical system views elderly patients as burdens rather than individuals, these mistakes will continue to happen." I spoke about the alliance we'd built, Maria with her compassion and courage, Tim with his legal expertise, Sarah with her communication skills, and the growing network of healthcare professionals committed to change. "What began as one woman's fight for dignity has become a movement," I said. "Not because I'm special, but because the problem is so pervasive and the need for change so urgent." As the interview concluded, the videographer wiped away a tear. "My grandmother went through something similar," she said quietly. "No one believed her when she said something was wrong with her medication. By the time they listened, she'd already been moved to a memory care facility she didn't need." Her story was one I'd heard countless times now. The elderly parent or grandparent whose concerns were dismissed, whose symptoms were attributed to just getting older without proper investigation. The completed video, posted on our website and social media channels, resonated far beyond our expectations. Within days, it had been viewed over 1 million times. News outlets picked it up, interview requests flooded in, and donations to support our work increased tenfold. But the most meaningful responses were the thousands of comments and messages from elderly individuals and their families sharing similar experiences and thanking us for giving voice to a problem that had been invisible for too long. The Senate hearing the following month was intimidating, but necessary. I sat before the Committee on Aging, bright lights and cameras capturing every moment as I testified about the systematic problems in geriatric care and the solutions we'd begun implementing through DAA. The issue isn't just individual bad doctors. It's a system that incentivizes quick diagnoses over thorough ones, that fails to recognize the complexity of geriatric medicine, and that often values efficiency over accuracy when it comes to elderly patients. I outlined our proposals for federal standards in cognitive disorder diagnoses, funding for geriatric specialization in medical training, and expanded resources for patient advocacy. Senator Elaine Harriman, the committee chair, leaned forward. "Mrs. Wilson, your work is commendable, but healthcare systems are complex and change slowly. What makes you believe these reforms are achievable?" "Because we're already achieving them, Senator," I replied confidently. Mercy General has reduced incorrect cognitive disorder diagnoses by 62% in the past year. 15 other hospitals implementing our protocols are seeing similar results. The changes we're proposing aren't theoretical. They're proven, practical solutions that save money, improve care, and protect the dignity of elderly Americans. The hearing led to the introduction of the Dignity and Aging Healthcare Act, which incorporated many of our recommendations. Though the legislative process would be long, it was a significant step toward nationwide reform. As DAA's influence grew, so did the challenges. Some healthcare providers and administrators resisted changes they saw as burdensome or unnecessary. Others attempted to co-opt our message while implementing only superficial reforms. Through it all, I remained focused on the mission. Each morning I read the new messages from elderly patients and their families, both success stories and ongoing struggles, to remind myself why this work mattered. 2 years after my misdiagnosis, I stood on stage at a national healthcare conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience was filled with doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and policymakers, the very people who had the power to implement the changes we advocated. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I spotted Dr. Reynolds sitting near the back. He looked older, more subdued than the confident young doctor who had so carelessly diagnosed me. I'd heard he was working at a small clinic now, under supervision, after a period of retraining. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave him a small nod. There was no animosity in the gesture, only acknowledgement. In an odd way, I had him to thank for this new chapter of my life, this unexpected final act that had given me purpose and impact beyond anything I could have imagined. 2 years ago, I was misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's. Today, I stand before you not as a victim of that misdiagnosis, but as the founder of an organization that has helped thousands of elderly patients receive proper care and maintain their autonomy. I paused, looking out at the attentive audience. They call me the Queen now, not because I wield power, but because I refuse to be invisible. Because I remind everyone I meet that age is not a disease, that experience is not a liability, and that every patient, regardless of their birth year, deserves to be seen as an individual. As I continued my address, outlining the progress we'd made and the work still to be done, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. What had begun as a personal injustice had transformed into a mission that gave meaning to my later years and helped countless others maintain their dignity and independence. The journey from hospital room to national advocate hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and frustrations, moments of doubt and exhaustion. But standing there, seeing the impact of our work reflected in changed policies, reformed practices, and most importantly, in the lives of elderly patients who are now receiving proper care, I knew it had all been worthwhile. I was no longer just Eleanor Wilson, retired bank manager and grandmother. I was Grandma Queen, champion of elderly dignity, proof that life's most meaningful chapter can begin at any age, even from a hospital room where a careless diagnosis nearly stole it all away.
What would those doctors think now if they could see how their dismissive attitude toward one confused old lady had sparked a nationwide movement for respect, dignity, and proper care for all elderly patients?
3 years after my misdiagnosis, DAA had offices in 38 states and partnerships with over 200 hospitals. The Dignity and Aging Healthcare Act had passed, establishing new federal standards for geriatric care and providing funding for specialized training programs. But despite our success, I knew our work was far from complete. While high-profile hospitals in major cities had embraced our reforms, many smaller facilities, particularly in rural areas, continued to struggle with inadequate resources and outdated practices. That's why I found myself on a small commuter plane heading to Millfield, a farming community in the Midwest, where the local hospital had reached out for our help after a series of troubling incidents involving elderly patients. Maria sat beside me, reviewing case notes on her tablet. At 32, she had become my right hand in this work, balancing her compassion with growing expertise in healthcare advocacy. Millfield General has only one geriatric specialist for a 60-mile radius, she noted, and their diagnostic equipment is nearly a decade old. So they're dealing with resource limitations, not just procedural issues, I replied, thinking through the implications. Our usual protocols assumed a certain baseline of staffing and equipment that might not apply here. The hospital administrator, Dr. Paul Jenkins, met us at the tiny airport. He was younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with tired eyes and an earnest manner. "Mrs. Wilson, Nurse Rodriguez, thank you for coming," he said, shaking our hands. "I've followed your work since the Mercy General reforms went public. What you're doing is revolutionizing geriatric care." "We're trying," I acknowledged, "but I understand you're facing some unique challenges here." During the drive to the hospital, Dr. Jenkins explained the situation. Millfield's population was aging as young people moved to larger cities for work. The hospital was treating an increasingly elderly patient base with limited resources and staff who lacked specialized geriatric training. Last month, we had 3 serious medication errors with elderly patients and 2 cases where patients were initially diagnosed with dementia but later found to have treatable conditions. We need help. The hospital was smaller than I expected, a 2-story brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Inside, the staff moved with the hurried efficiency of people trying to do too much with too little. Dr. Jenkins had arranged a meeting with key personnel, the director of nursing, the 1 geriatric specialist, the head of the emergency department, and several floor nurses who regularly worked with elderly patients. "We've reviewed your protocols," said Dr. Eliza Gray, the geriatric specialist, "but implementing them with our staffing levels and equipment seems impossible." I listened as they detailed their challenges: the lack of specialists, outdated diagnostic tools, limited time per patient, and the geographical realities that made it difficult for many elderly patients to travel for second opinions or specialized care. This was different from Mercy General, where the problems had stemmed primarily from systemic bias and careless procedures rather than resource limitations. Our standard solutions wouldn't work here without adaptation. "We need to develop a rural approach," I told Maria during a quick break, "something that addresses these specific constraints while still ensuring quality care." Over the next 3 days, we immersed ourselves in Millfield General's operations. We observed patient interactions, reviewed procedures, and most importantly, listened to the staff's ideas and concerns. Many had innovative workarounds for resource limitations that could be formalized and shared. On our final day, we presented a customized plan to the hospital leadership. It included 1. A simplified diagnostic checklist for non-specialists to help identify when cognitive symptoms might indicate conditions other than dementia. 2. A telehealth partnership with a university hospital's geriatrics department for remote second opinions. 3. A training program for all staff, not just specialists, on geriatric-specific considerations. 4. A volunteer transportation network to help elderly patients access specialized care when needed. And 5. A monthly community outreach program to educate elderly patients and their families about advocating for appropriate care. This isn't about implementing perfect procedures. It's about making meaningful improvements within your constraints, small changes that can prevent big mistakes, I explained. Dr. Jenkins looked visibly relieved. "This actually seems doable with our resources. When can we start?" "Immediately," Maria replied with a smile. "We've already drafted the simplified checklist and outlined the training program, and I've spoken with University Hospital about the telehealth partnership. They're on board." As we prepared to leave Millfield, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges here were different from what we had faced at Mercy, but the underlying issue remained the same:
ensuring elderly patients received appropriate, dignified care regardless of circumstances.
The Millfield visit marked a turning point for DAA. We realized that a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work across America's diverse healthcare landscape. Rural hospitals, urban medical centers, community clinics, each required tailored strategies that addressed their specific challenges while maintaining core standards. Over the next year, we developed specialized programs for different healthcare settings. Our rural initiative, inspired by Millfield, eventually reached over 300 small hospitals across the country. We created a certification program that recognized facilities meeting our standards for geriatric care, giving patients and families a way to identify hospitals committed to appropriate elder care. Meanwhile, our advocacy work continued on the national stage. I testified before Congress twice more as amendments to the Dignity and Aging Healthcare Act were considered. Our research team published studies documenting the financial and human cost of misdiagnoses in elderly patients, providing hard data to support our calls for reform. On my 80th birthday, the staff at DAA threw a surprise party at our headquarters, now a modern office building in downtown with "Dignity at Any Age" emblazoned across the entrance. The conference room was packed with staff, volunteers, healthcare partners, and many of the patients we'd helped over the years. Sarah had organized the event, bringing together people from every phase of our journey. Maria and Tim, of course, but also Dr. Patel from Mercy General, several board members who had supported our initial reforms, and even some of the journalists who had first covered our story. "Speech!" someone called out after the cake had been cut. I looked around at the gathered faces. Young medical students who had chosen geriatric specialties because of our work, nurses who had become advocates within their facilities, elderly patients who had reclaimed their autonomy with our help. "When I was misdiagnosed 4 years ago," I began, "I never imagined it would lead to all of this. I was simply fighting for my own dignity, my own right to be seen as more than just my age." I paused, feeling the emotion of the moment. What I've learned since then is that dignity isn't something we should have to fight for. It should be the foundation of all healthcare, regardless of age. Every day, each of you carries that mission forward. You see the person, not just the patient. You listen, you take the time, and in doing so, you're changing not just individual lives, but the entire culture of geriatric care. The room erupted in applause, and as I looked at the faces around me, some tearful, all determined, I felt a profound sense of legacy. Whatever happened next, this work would continue. The movement we had built was larger than any one person. It had taken on a life of its own. As the party wound down, Maria approached me with a young doctor I didn't recognize. "Eleanor, this is Dr. James Collins. He just completed his geriatric fellowship and wants to join our medical advisory board." "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Wilson," the young doctor said, shaking my hand firmly. "Your work is the reason I chose geriatrics. I want to be part of ensuring that every elderly patient is treated with the dignity and thoroughness they deserve." I studied him carefully. His earnest expression, the way he met my gaze directly without the condescension I'd experienced from too many young doctors. "Tell me, Dr. Collins, what's the first thing you notice when an elderly patient walks into your office?" He considered the question thoughtfully. "Not their age," he finally replied, "their story. Everyone carries a lifetime of experiences that shapes who they are and how they experience health and illness. My job is to understand that story as much as their symptoms." I smiled, feeling a surge of hope for the future. This was what real change looked like. Not just new protocols and legislation, but a fundamental shift in how healthcare professionals viewed elderly patients. Later that evening, as Sarah drove me home, she asked, "Are you ever going to retire, Mom? For real this time?" I laughed. Why would I? I'm just getting started. But the truth was, I had been thinking about succession planning. I wouldn't be around forever, and the work needed to continue without me. Maria was the obvious choice to eventually take over leadership of DAA, with her combination of medical knowledge,
advocacy skills, and unwavering commitment to our mission. As I gazed out the window at the passing city lights, I reflected on the unexpected journey of these past 4 years. From a hospital room where a careless doctor had nearly stripped away my autonomy to becoming Grandma Queen, advocate for elderly dignity nationwide, life certainly had surprising turns. What would that young doctor think now, seeing how his hasty misdiagnosis had sparked a movement that was transforming geriatric care across the country? Would he understand that in trying to diminish me, he had inadvertently helped me find my greatest purpose?
5 years after my misdiagnosis, I received an unexpected invitation to deliver the commencement address at the University of Michigan Medical School, where they had just established a new Center for Excellence in Geriatric Medicine, partially funded by grants from our foundation. "They specifically requested you, Mom," Sarah said, showing me the formal invitation. "The dean wrote that your work has fundamentally reshaped how we prepare physicians to care for elderly patients." At 81, I had begun scaling back my travel, focusing more on strategic direction, while Maria and our growing team handled the day-to-day operations of DAA. But this invitation felt significant, a chance to speak directly to the next generation of doctors before they formed the habits and biases that had led to my own misdiagnosis. The commencement was scheduled for May, giving me several months to prepare. I worked on my address carefully, wanting to strike the right balance between challenging these young doctors to do better and encouraging them in their chosen path. When the day arrived, I found myself in academic regalia, seated on stage with university officials and distinguished faculty. Looking out at the sea of soon-to-be doctors in their caps and gowns, I felt the weight of the moment. These young people would touch thousands of lives throughout their careers. How they approached elderly patients could make the difference between dignity and dismissal, between accurate diagnosis and dangerous assumptions. The dean introduced me with a flattering summary of DAA's accomplishments and my personal journey from patient to national advocate. As I approached the podium, the applause was respectful, if not exactly enthusiastic. These were young people eager to begin their careers, not particularly interested in hearing from an elderly woman, no matter how impressive her credentials. I knew I had to catch their attention quickly. 5 years ago, I began. A doctor not much older than you are today looked at me and saw only my age. In less than 15 minutes, he diagnosed me with Alzheimer's disease without performing adequate tests. He prescribed medications I didn't need and set in motion a plan that would have stripped away my independence, my dignity, and potentially years of my life. The room grew quiet. That doctor wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly negligent by the standards of the time. He was simply practicing medicine the way he'd been taught, efficiently, confidently, and with unconscious biases about elderly patients that no one had ever challenged. I paused, looking out at the attentive faces. Today, I'm not here to demonize that doctor or the medical establishment. I'm here to ask you a question that will define your career more than any diagnostic technique or treatment protocol you've learned. When an elderly patient walks into your office, what will you see first? Their age or their humanity? For the next 20 minutes, I spoke about the unique challenges and rewards of treating elderly patients. I shared stories from our work, both tragic cases where assumptions led to misdiagnoses and inspiring examples of thorough, respectful care that transformed lives. Medicine is changing, I told them. The Dignity in Aging Healthcare Act has established new standards. Hospitals are implementing better protocols, but laws and protocols are only as effective as the people implementing them. Real change happens in exam rooms, in those crucial moments when you decide how much time to spend, which questions to ask, which tests to order, and, most importantly, how carefully you listen to the person in front of you. I concluded by returning to my own story. That misdiagnosis, painful as it was, gave me the greatest gift, a final chapter filled with purpose, impact, and meaning. But not every elderly patient has the resources, knowledge, or support system to challenge a wrong diagnosis. Many simply accept what they are told,
their worlds growing smaller as they're medicated for conditions they don't have or denied treatments for conditions they do. You, I said, looking directly at the graduates, will hold that power in your hands. Use it wisely. See the person, not just the patient. Listen more than you speak. Question your assumptions. And remember that age is not a disease. It's simply one factor among many that makes each patient unique.
The applause when I finished was different from the polite reception I'd received at the beginning, more enthusiastic, more engaged. As I returned to my seat, the dean leaned over. "That was exactly what they needed to hear," she whispered, "and what some of our faculty needed to hear as well." After the ceremony, several graduates approached me, sharing stories about grandparents who had experienced similar situations, or expressing how my words had shifted their thinking about elderly patients. One young woman, with tears in her eyes, told me she had chosen geriatrics because of her beloved grandmother, but had been discouraged by mentors who considered it a less prestigious specialty. "After hearing you today," she said, "I'm recommitting to my original path. This work matters." That evening, back in my hotel room, I reflected on the day. Speaking to those young doctors had energized me in a way I hadn't expected. They represented the future, the possibility that the changes we were fighting for could become permanent, embedded in medical education and practice. My phone rang. It was Maria, calling for an update on the commencement. "It went well," I told her, "very well, but it got me thinking about our education initiatives." Currently, DAA provided supplemental training for practicing healthcare providers and consulted on curriculum development for medical schools. But what if we could reach medical students earlier and more directly? "We should establish a formal fellowship program," I suggested, identify promising medical students interested in geriatrics, and provide mentorship, specialized training, and research opportunities. Build the next generation of geriatric specialists who approach elderly care with the right mindset from the beginning. Maria was immediately enthusiastic. "The Grandma Queen Fellows," she suggested with a laugh. "We could partner with medical schools across the country." By the time I returned home, the idea had evolved into a concrete proposal. We would select 10 medical students annually, provide financial support for their education in exchange for a commitment to geriatric practice, and pair them with mentors from our network of reformed hospitals. When I presented the fellowship program to our board of directors, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Several board members offered additional funding to expand the program beyond our initial proposal. Dr. Chen, who had remained our medical director while also teaching at the university, volunteered to oversee the curriculum development. This could transform geriatric medicine from a specialty of last resort to a sought-after field, especially if we emphasize the complex diagnostic challenges and the meaningful patient relationships. The first class of fellows was selected the following year. 10 diverse, passionate medical students who had demonstrated both academic excellence and genuine compassion for elderly patients. We gathered them for an orientation week at DAA headquarters, where they met with leaders in geriatric medicine, patient advocates, and elderly individuals who had experienced both outstanding and problematic care. On the final day of orientation, I met with the fellows for an informal lunch. They were curious about my journey, eager to hear the details that hadn't made it into the public narrative. "Were you scared when you realized what was happening?" one young man asked. "Terrified," I admitted, "not just of losing my independence, but of losing myself, my memories, my personality, everything that made me who I was." "What would you have done if the hospital board hadn't supported your reforms?" asked another. I smiled. Plan B was a press conference on the hospital steps with all the evidence Tim had gathered and testimonials from other misdiagnosed patients. But I'm glad it didn't come to that. Collaborative change is always more effective than forced change. A young woman who had been quiet throughout the lunch finally spoke up. "Mrs. Wilson, do you ever regret not pursuing legal action against Dr. Reynolds? You could have received a significant settlement." It was a fair question, one I had been asked many times over the years.
This was never about money, I explained. It was about changing a system that failed not just me, but countless elderly patients. A lawsuit might have punished one doctor and compensated one patient, but it wouldn't have addressed the underlying issues. I looked around at their thoughtful faces. The greatest justice wasn't seeing Dr. Reynolds lose his position. It was seeing hospitals adopt protocols that prevent those mistakes from happening again. It was hearing from elderly patients who received proper diagnoses because of our work. It was creating a world where age isn't seen as an automatic explanation for every symptom. As the lunch concluded and the fellows prepared to return to their respective medical schools, I felt a profound sense of continuation. These young doctors, with their combination of scientific knowledge and genuine compassion, represented the future we had been working toward, a future where elderly patients would be seen, heard, and treated with the dignity they deserved. One fellowship program wouldn't transform the entire medical establishment overnight, but like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in water, these 10 young doctors would influence their colleagues, who would influence others, gradually shifting the culture of geriatric care. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset, I thought about the long, unexpected journey from that hospital room to this moment. What had begun as a personal fight for dignity had grown into a movement that was changing how medicine approached elderly care across the country. And now, through these fellows, our work would continue long after I was gone. What would that young doctor think now, seeing how his careless diagnosis had sparked a transformation that would shape medical practice for generations to come?
7 years after my misdiagnosis, DAA had become the leading advocate for elderly patient rights in the country. Our protocols had been adopted by over 500 hospitals. Our fellowship program had expanded to 30 medical students annually. The legislative reforms we'd championed had become the gold standard for geriatric care. But as the organization grew, I found myself stepping back from day-to-day operations. At 83, I still participated in strategic planning and occasionally testified before legislative committees, but Maria had taken over as executive director, leading DAA with a combination of passion and strategic thinking that impressed me daily. "You've built something remarkable," Tim told me over lunch one day. "Most advocacy organizations don't survive their founders' active involvement. DAA is positioned to continue its work for decades." It was true. We had a strong leadership team, stable funding through grants and donations, and a clear mission that resonated with healthcare providers and the public alike. The work would continue whether I was actively involved or not. This realization brought both satisfaction and a certain restlessness. I was proud of what we'd accomplished, but I also felt the pull of other interests I'd set aside during these intense years of advocacy: my gardening, my grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren, the travel I'd postponed. Sarah noticed my thoughtfulness. "You're thinking of stepping back, aren't you?" she asked me one evening as we sat on my porch watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. "Maybe," I admitted. "DAA doesn't need me the way it once did. Maria has it well in hand." "So what would retirement look like this time?" Sarah asked with a smile, referencing my previous retirement from banking that had been anything but idle. I laughed. "Less congressional testimony, more gardening. Though I doubt I'll ever fully step away from the work." The decision crystallized a few weeks later when I received a call from Evelyn Park, a 79-year-old woman in Oregon who had reached out to DAA after experiencing a situation similar to mine. With our help, she had not only corrected her own misdiagnosis, but had gone on to establish a local patient advocacy group that had partnered with hospitals throughout the Pacific Northwest. "Eleanor," she said, her voice crackling with excitement, "we've got something amazing happening here. The Senior Center Network is implementing a peer advocacy program, training elderly volunteers to accompany other seniors to medical appointments. They act as additional sets of ears, help ask questions, and ensure patients understand their diagnoses and treatment options.
It was a brilliant, grassroots approach to the problem we'd been addressing at the policy and hospital levels. We've got 12 centers participating already, Evelyn continued, and we're seeing remarkable results. Doctors take more time when there's an advocate present, and patients feel more confident asking questions. As she described the program, I felt a familiar spark, the same excitement I'd experienced when we'd first formulated our reforms at Mercy General. This peer advocacy model could complement our institutional work, creating a network of support at the community level. Evelyn, I'd like to learn more, I told her. Would you mind if I came out to see the program in action?
2 weeks later, I found myself in Portland, observing as trained senior advocates accompanied elderly patients to medical appointments. The dynamic was fascinating. The presence of an advocate, especially one close in age to the patient, subtly shifted the power balance in the exam room. Doctors took more time, explained more thoroughly, and were less likely to dismiss symptoms as just aging. We'd like to expand, Evelyn explained, as we discussed the program over dinner, but we need help with training materials, evaluation metrics, and funding. I was hoping DAA might be interested in partnering with us. I was more than interested. I was inspired. This could be my next chapter, a way to continue contributing while stepping back from the administrative demands of running DAA, a community-based complement to our institutional work. Upon returning home, I presented the idea to Maria and our leadership team, a Seniors Advocating for Seniors initiative that would replicate Evelyn's model nationwide, with DAA providing training, resources, and evaluation. "It's perfect," Maria exclaimed. "We've been focusing on changing the system from the top down. This addresses the problem from the ground up, empowering elderly patients directly." Over the next 6 months, we developed a comprehensive program. I worked closely with Evelyn and her team to document their processes, create training materials, and establish standards for volunteer advocates. We secured funding from several foundations interested in senior health and began pilot programs in 10 cities. The response exceeded our expectations. Senior centers, retirement communities, and community organizations eagerly adopted the program. Elderly volunteers, many of whom had experienced healthcare dismissal themselves, found purpose in helping their peers navigate medical appointments. As the program expanded, I found myself energized by this new direction. Rather than managing an organization, I was back in the field, training advocates, meeting with community leaders, and occasionally accompanying patients to appointments myself to observe and refine our approach. On my 84th birthday, instead of a formal celebration at DAA headquarters, I found myself in a community center in Chicago, training a group of 20 seniors to become patient advocates. They ranged in age from 65 to 92, each bringing valuable life experience and a commitment to helping others maintain their dignity in healthcare settings. "Why does this matter so much to you?" asked one participant, a retired teacher named Gloria. "You've already changed hospital protocols and laws. Why focus on this grassroots approach now?" It was a thoughtful question, one that made me reflect on the evolution of our work. Laws and protocols are essential, I explained, but they're not enough on their own. Real change happens in individual exam rooms, in those crucial moments between patient and provider. By empowering seniors to advocate for themselves and each other, we're addressing the problem at its roots. I paused, remembering my own experience with Dr. Reynolds. And there's something powerful about having someone beside you who truly understands what you're going through, not just a professional advocate, but a peer who has navigated the same challenges. As the Seniors Advocating for Seniors program grew, we began collecting data on its impact. The results were compelling. Patients with advocates reported greater satisfaction with their care, better understanding of their diagnoses and treatment options, and fewer instances of feeling dismissed or rushed. Perhaps most significantly, we documented numerous cases where the presence of an advocate had prevented potential misdiagnoses or inappropriate treatments. Doctors, knowing they would need to explain their reasoning to not just the patient, but an informed advocate, were more likely to order appropriate tests and consider alternative explanations for symptoms.
On the 8th anniversary of my misdiagnosis, I found myself reflecting on the journey as I sat in my garden, surrounded by the roses I'd finally had time to tend properly again. From that moment of fear and anger in a hospital room to a national movement with multiple approaches to ensuring elderly dignity, it had been an unexpected but profoundly meaningful path. My phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling from the university. "Eleanor," she said, her voice brimming with excitement, "you won't believe this. The medical school curriculum committee just approved our proposal. Starting next year, every medical student will complete a rotation with senior advocates, accompanying them to appointments to understand the elderly patient experience firsthand. It was a breakthrough we'd been working toward for years, embedding empathy and understanding of the elderly experience directly into medical education." "That's wonderful news," I said, feeling a swell of satisfaction. "These students will never look at elderly patients the same way again." "It's all coming full circle," Dr. Chen replied. "The system is changing from every direction. Protocols, legislation, education, and now peer advocacy. We're creating a new normal where dignity at any age isn't just a slogan, but a reality." After we hung up, I sat in my garden a bit longer, watching butterflies flit among the flowers. 8 years ago, a careless diagnosis had nearly robbed me of my autonomy and dignity. Today, because of that same diagnosis, thousands of elderly patients were receiving better care. Hundreds of doctors were being trained differently, and seniors across the country were finding purpose as advocates for their peers. Sometimes life's greatest purpose emerges from its greatest challenges. Sometimes a single moment of injustice can spark a movement for change that extends beyond what anyone could have imagined. And sometimes a supposedly confused old lady can transform not just her own final chapter, but the very system that tried to diminish her. What would that young doctor think now, seeing the movement that had grown from his careless diagnosis? Would he understand that in trying to reduce me to my age, he had inadvertently created a world where age no longer defined a patient's worth or determined the quality of their care?
10 years after my misdiagnosis, I celebrated my 86th birthday surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues from every phase of DAA's development. The gathering was held in the garden of my home, the same home where Sarah had once gently suggested I consider assisted living based on Dr. Reynolds' false diagnosis. Maria had organized a beautiful celebration, with photos documenting our journey displayed throughout the garden. There I was, testifying before Congress, cutting the ribbon at the Patient Advocacy Center, training the first class of fellowship recipients, and working with senior advocates in communities across the country. Grandma Queen's Decade of Dignity read a banner hanging between 2 oak trees. The nickname still made me chuckle, though it had become so widely used that even medical journals sometimes referred to the Grandma Queen protocols when discussing our standards for geriatric care. As I moved through the crowd, accepting birthday wishes and catching up with old friends, I was struck by how many lives had intertwined with mine through this work. Dr. Patel, now the Chief Medical Officer at Mercy General. Tim, still providing legal guidance to DAA while also teaching healthcare law at the university. The first class of fellows, now practicing physicians leading geriatric departments across the country. Evelyn Park and other senior advocates who had built thriving programs in their communities. Each represented a branch of the movement that had grown from that single moment in a hospital room, a movement that had transformed not just how elderly patients were treated, but how they saw themselves and their place in the healthcare system. Sarah approached with a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, professionally dressed, with a hesitant smile. "Mom, there's someone who wanted to meet you," Sarah said. "This is Amanda Reynolds." Reynolds? The name registered immediately. "Dr. Reynolds' daughter," Amanda clarified, extending her hand. "I hope it's okay that I came. I've wanted to meet you for a long time." I was momentarily speechless. In all these years, I had never had direct contact with Dr. Reynolds' family.
I took her offered hand, studying her face. "Of course it's okay," I finally said, "but I'm surprised. I wouldn't have thought that I'd want to meet the woman whose work led to my father's professional difficulties." Amanda finished with a small smile. "I understand that, but it's more complicated than that." She glanced around at the crowded garden. "Could we talk privately for a few minutes?" Curious, I led her to a quiet corner of the garden where a stone bench sat beneath a flowering dogwood. As we settled on the bench, I noticed she carried a small package wrapped in blue paper. "My father passed away last year, pancreatic cancer. It was quick." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said sincerely. Despite everything, I had never wished Dr. Reynolds ill. Amanda nodded her thanks. During his final weeks, he talked a lot about his career, the patients he'd helped, the mistakes he'd made, and he talked about you. I waited, unsure where this was heading. "He said you were the wake-up call he needed," she continued. "After leaving Mercy, he went through a difficult period, depression, questioning his abilities as a doctor. But eventually he took a position at a small community clinic where he had to spend more time with each patient out of necessity. There were no shortcuts possible." She looked down at the package in her hands. "He said it made him a better doctor, more present, more careful. He started following your work, reading about the changes you were implementing. He kept a file of articles about DAA. This was unexpected. I had sometimes wondered what had happened to Dr. Reynolds after he left Mercy, but I had never imagined him following our work. Before he died, he asked me to give you this," Amanda said, offering me the package. "He said you probably wouldn't want to hear from him directly, but he hoped you might accept it through me." With slightly trembling hands, I unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope with my name written in an unfamiliar hand.
He started the journal after leaving Mercy, Amanda explained. It's his reflections on patient care, particularly for elderly patients. He thought maybe it could be useful for your training programs as a case study in how not to practice and then how to learn from those mistakes. I ran my hand over the journal's cover, moved by the gesture. "Thank you for bringing this. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," she admitted. "Part of me resented you for years, but as I saw how my father changed, how he became more thoughtful, more thorough with his patients, I began to understand that what happened was necessary, not just for the patients he might have misdiagnosed, but for him too." We sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party a gentle backdrop to this unexpected reconciliation. "Would you like to stay? Meet some of the people who've been part of this journey?" Amanda hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that. Dad would have wanted me to see the full scope of what grew from his mistake." As we rejoined the party, I kept the journal and letter with me, curious, but not yet ready to read Dr. Reynolds' private thoughts. That would be for later, when I could give them my full attention. The celebration continued into the evening, with toasts and speeches and reminiscences. Maria presented a video compilation of testimonials from patients, healthcare providers, and advocates whose lives had been touched by our work. The final segment featured the newest generation of our impact, medical students in the fellowship program and young doctors who had been trained with our protocols from the beginning of their careers. "This is your legacy, Eleanor," she said, raising her glass. "Not just the lives you've directly touched, but the generations of elderly patients who will receive better care because you refused to accept that misdiagnosis 10 years ago." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself sitting with Sarah, Tim, and Maria, the original core of our movement, watching the sunset paint the garden in golden light. "Did you ever imagine it would grow like this?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the photos documenting our journey. "Never," I admitted. "I just wanted to make sure what happened to me didn't happen to others.
one hospital, one doctor at a time if necessary. And how it's national policy, Tim noted. The Dignity in Aging Healthcare Act has changed the standard of care in every hospital in the country. But the most important change isn't in the legislation or the protocols. It's in how elderly patients see themselves as advocates with rights, not just recipients of care. She was right. Beyond all the structural reforms, the most profound transformation had been in patient empowerment. Across the country, elderly individuals were entering healthcare settings not as passive, grateful recipients, but as active participants with expectations for respectful, thorough care. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, I sat in my study with Dr. Reynolds' journal and letter. I opened the envelope first, unfolding a handwritten letter dated just weeks before his death. Mrs. Wilson, you will likely receive this, and I would understand if you choose not to read further. But as I face the end of my life, I feel compelled to thank you for changing the course of mine. The letter continued, detailing how my case had forced him to confront his biases and shortcuts, how his subsequent fall from professional grace had ultimately led to a more meaningful practice of medicine. What I did to you was inexcusable, he wrote. I looked at your age instead of you. I made assumptions that could have robbed you of years of independence and dignity. The irony is that in trying to diminish you, I inadvertently gave you the platform to become far more influential than I ever was. He went on to describe how he had followed DAA's growth, how he had implemented our protocols in his own modest practice, and how he had begun advocating for better geriatric care within his community. In the end, the letter concluded, your misdiagnosis may have been the most fortunate error of my career, not for me personally, but for the countless elderly patients who now receive better care because of the movement you built. You turned a moment of medical arrogance into a decade of progress. For that, I thank you and ask not for forgiveness, but for the acceptance of my profound respect. James Reynolds, MD. I set the letter down, wiping unexpected tears from my eyes. In all the scenarios I had imagined over the years, I had never considered that Dr. Reynolds might have viewed our encounter as transformative for himself as well. Opening the journal, I found meticulous notes on patient interactions, reflections on biases and assumptions, and techniques for more thorough assessment of elderly patients. The early entries showed a man struggling with professional shame and searching for a better approach. The later ones revealed a physician who had found purpose in careful, dignified care. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't realized I was missing. The circle that had begun with anger and injustice had somehow, through 10 years of dedicated work, transformed into understanding and even a kind of reconciliation. The next morning, I called Maria. I'd like to add something to our training materials, I told her, explaining about Dr. Reynolds' journal. Not using his name, of course, but the content, the journey from assumption to thorough care, could be valuable, especially for doctors who may recognize themselves in the earlier entries. That's interesting, Maria said, but I think you're right. It shows that change is possible, not just in systems, but in individual providers. As I hung up, I looked out my window at the garden, still bearing signs of yesterday's celebration. 10 years, from misdiagnosis to movement. 10 years of fighting, not just for my own dignity, but for every elderly patient. 10 years of transforming a personal injustice into a national reform. What would my life have been without that misdiagnosis? Quieter, certainly, focused on gardening and grandchildren rather than congressional testimony and hospital protocols, but somehow less complete, less purposeful. In attempting to reduce me to my age, Dr. Reynolds had inadvertently helped me transcend it, becoming not just an elderly woman, but a force for change, a voice for those who had been silenced by assumptions, and ultimately, a catalyst for a more dignified approach to aging in America's healthcare system. From hospital room to national movement, from dismissed patient to grandma queen. What an unexpected, challenging, and ultimately meaningful final chapter it had been.
12 years after my misdiagnosis, at 88 years old, I found myself back at Mercy General Hospital, not as a patient this time, but as the guest of honor. The hospital was dedicating its new geriatric care wing, and they had asked me to cut the ribbon. The Eleanor Wilson Center for Dignified Aging read the sign above the entrance, establishing a new standard of care. The irony wasn't lost on me. The hospital where I had been so carelessly misdiagnosed was now naming a facility after me. But it was also fitting, a testament to how completely the institution had transformed its approach to elderly care. Dr. Patel, now in her final year as Chief Medical Officer before retirement, greeted me warmly. This center embodies everything you fought for, Eleanor: specialized staff trained in geriatric care, protocols that require thorough assessment before diagnosis, and patient advocates integrated into every step of the process. She led me on a tour of the new wing. Unlike the sterile, clinical environments typical of hospitals, this space had been designed with elderly patients in mind: comfortable seating areas, natural lighting, art on the walls, and most importantly, private consultation rooms where patients and doctors could talk without the rushed atmosphere of traditional exam rooms. We've incorporated all the elements of the Grandma Queen protocols, Dr. Patel explained, using the nickname that had become the official designation for our standards of care. But we've also added some innovations based on research from our fellowship graduates. She showed me a unique feature of the center, a simulation room where medical students and residents experienced what it was like to be an elderly patient. Using specialized equipment that mimicked visual impairments, hearing loss, and mobility challenges, young doctors gained empathy for the physical realities their elderly patients faced. This was Dr. Chen's idea, Dr. Patel noted. She found that experiential learning created more lasting changes in attitude than any amount of lecturing. The dedication ceremony was attended by hospital staff, community members, and representatives from healthcare organizations across the country. Maria delivered an eloquent speech about the journey from my misdiagnosis to this moment, highlighting how one hospital's failure had ultimately led to nationwide improvements in geriatric care. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the gathered faces, many familiar from our years of work together, others new to me, but part of the extending impact of our efforts. 12 years ago, I sat in an exam room in this very hospital and heard a diagnosis that would have altered the course of my final years. Today, I stand before you celebrating not just how far this hospital has come, but how much has changed for elderly patients across America. I spoke about the multiple dimensions of our work, the protocols and legislation that had reformed institutional practices, the education initiatives that were shaping a new generation of doctors, and the advocacy programs that were empowering elderly patients to participate actively in their care. But buildings and protocols are only part of the story, I continued. The true measure of our success is in the countless elderly Americans who now receive thorough, respectful care, who are seen as individuals with unique histories and needs, not just as their age or their symptoms. After cutting the ribbon to officially open the center, I found myself surrounded by well-wishers, including several of the hospital board members who had initially supported our reforms. One of them, Richard Winters, the former legal counsel, who had been skeptical during our first meeting, approached with a sheepish smile. "I didn't fully understand the scope of what you were trying to accomplish back then.
I was thinking in terms of liability and risk management, not transformation. You've changed how this entire hospital approaches patient care, not just for the elderly." His words echoed what I had been hearing increasingly in recent years, that the principles we had established for dignified elderly care were influencing medical practice more broadly, creating a more patient-centered approach across all age groups.
After the ceremony, Maria and I walked slowly through the gardens outside the hospital, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. "We've accomplished so much," Maria said. "The protocols, the legislation, the fellowship program, the advocacy network. But I keep thinking about what's next, how we keep this momentum going and address the challenges that remain." At 88, I was now firmly in an advisory role with DAA, participating in strategic discussions but leaving the day-to-day leadership to Maria and her team. I still gave occasional speeches and met with policymakers, but my focus had shifted more toward mentoring the next generation of advocates. "What's next," I said thoughtfully, "is continuing to adapt. Healthcare is constantly evolving, and our approach needs to evolve with it. The telehealth explosion, artificial intelligence in diagnostics, the shift toward home-based care, all of these present new opportunities and challenges for ensuring elderly dignity." We had already begun addressing these emerging issues. Our latest initiative focused on ethical guidelines for AI diagnostic tools to prevent algorithmic bias against elderly patients. We were also developing standards for telehealth services to ensure they remained accessible and effective for seniors. "The work will never be completely finished," I continued. "Each generation will face new challenges, but what matters is that we've changed the fundamental assumption that age alone is not a diagnosis, and elderly patients deserve the same thorough, respectful care as anyone else." Maria nodded. "And we've built something that will continue that work, regardless of who's leading it." That evening, as Sarah drove me home from the dedication, she asked a question that caught me by surprise. "Are you satisfied, Mom, with everything you've accomplished?" I looked out the window at the passing scenery, considering her question carefully. Satisfied isn't quite the right word. Perhaps grateful. Grateful that something as painful as that misdiagnosis could lead to so much positive change. Grateful for the people who joined this journey, you, Maria, Tim, and so many others. Grateful that at this stage of life, I found purpose that extended beyond myself. Sarah smiled. "You've always had purpose, Mom. You just found a bigger platform for it." She was right. The qualities that had made me a successful bank manager, attention to detail, systemic thinking, and a fundamental belief in treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances, had served me equally well as an advocate. The difference was scale and impact. As we arrived home, I noticed a small package on my doorstep. Opening it, I found a framed photograph of today's ribbon-cutting ceremony, already printed and delivered. With it was a note from one of our fellowship graduates, now the director of geriatric medicine at a major hospital in Chicago. "Your work changed the trajectory of my career and the lives of countless patients," he had written. "Today's dedication is just one visible symbol of a transformation that happens every day in exam rooms across the country. Elderly patients being seen, heard, and treated with the dignity they deserve." I placed the photograph on my mantle alongside other milestones from this unexpected chapter of my life. Testifying before Congress, receiving the National Patient Advocacy Award, training the first class of senior advocates.
Each represented a step in the journey from that hospital room where a careless diagnosis had nearly diminished me to a national movement that had elevated the standard of care for all elderly Americans. 12 years ago, Dr. Reynolds had looked at me and seen only my age. Today, because of that misdiagnosis and everything that had grown from it, doctors across the country were learning to see beyond age to the individual with their unique history, needs, and dignity. From hospital room to movement to lasting change, from dismissed patient to grandma queen, to a name on a building dedicated to dignified care. What an extraordinary final chapter it had been. Not just for me, but for elderly patients everywhere who would now receive the respect and thorough care they deserved. As I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea, I felt a deep sense of completion. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, whatever new frontiers DAA faced in ensuring elderly dignity, the foundation had been laid for lasting change. The movement would continue, evolving to meet new needs, but always guided by the core principle that started it all. Age is not a diagnosis. Dignity is not optional. And sometimes the most powerful advocate is a supposedly confused old lady who refuses to be diminished by assumptions. What would that young doctor think now, seeing his careless diagnosis transformed into a movement that had fundamentally changed how America's healthcare system approached its elderly patients? Perhaps, like Dr. Reynolds in his final letter, he would recognize that in trying to reduce me to my age, he had inadvertently helped create a world where age no longer defined a patient's worth or determined the quality of their care.